Today's entire program will be recorded, and the entire slide deck will be made available. So the full recording and the slide deck are going to be available, and everyone who attended, in fact, everybody who registered for the webinar, will be receiving links to those within 24 hours after the webinar. Could be today, depending upon how long it takes to get everything uploaded. It might be tomorrow, but certainly within 24 hours. So with that, I've mentioned the format and what we're talking about and the raised hand feature. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Todaro, founder, president, and COO of Ascendle. Dave?
Thanks, Angela. I appreciate it, and thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day to join us and talk about Agile project estimating. One other thing I'll add to what Angelo said is that if you do have a question during the presentation and you think you might forget the question, there is also a feature where you can type in the question into GoToMeeting, and then it will give me a list at the end. And if you're using an app on an iPad, it's a little question mark button, and if you're using the desktop app, there's a questions area where you can type that in. So like Angelo said, we're talking about Agile project estimating with Planning Poker. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of estimating that has been prevalent in the software industry, and then talk about this idea of Planning Poker, what is it all about, and then finally step through an example of that. And so, just as Angela mentioned, my name is Dave Todaro. I'm president and COO of Ascendle. And just briefly about Ascendle, what we do is we do contract software engineering. We take business requirements, anything from an idea on a napkin to a completely mocked up software application, and we take that and produce commercial grade software. So we provide a turnkey software development opportunity for our partners. We do handle the full product lifecycle, from helping you come up with the idea of your app if you don't have it solidified, to creating the code, testing it, shipping it, and then even after shipment, helping to provide support either to your team and or in some cases directly to your customers. Our software has won a number of awards, the most recent being one of our clients, Industry MD, here in New Hampshire, has won the first place in the 2015 Tech Out Award and won $50,000 as the first prize in that contest. And then finally, we're excited to say that since our inception, we've been enjoying 100% year-over-year growth. So that's just a little bit about our company. Enough with the commercial and on to the meat. So this is about Agile project estimation. And Agile, whether it's Scrum, Agile, whatever you call it, has a couple of promises. So first of all, flexibility. We don't have this situation where we sit down for a number of months and write this 200-page document, and then that becomes the Bible, and then we can't change anything. We also have the ability to respond to change. So as we are executing the process, we can get feedback from our customers, and they can tell us what they like, what they don't like, and then we can make course corrections along the way based on that feedback. And then finally, what we can do is, if we thought that we were going to take 6 months to build this product and then release it, but we start showing it to people along the way, and we realize that after 4 months, you know what, people are saying that they want this now, we can decide when to release it, which is fantastic. Stakeholders need some things in order to make this whole process work. First, they need a level of predictability. So they can't just have this big question mark around, well, what is this going to take? How long will this take? What if I make changes? They need to plan ahead. So they may need to launch a big marketing campaign or get the customer support team ready to go. And essentially what they need to be able to do is know that they can release on a schedule. So we have these sort of two conflicting concepts, which is Agile, which is all about change and flexibility and course corrections. While on the stakeholder side, they need things a little bit more nailed down. They want all this flexibility and the ability to change, but they also need to be able to make their plans. So just to give you a little bit of context, what we're talking about today is just one part of the overall process of figuring out how long it will take to build software. We actually have another webinar that we've done, which is available on our website, which is all about taking this process all the way through. But essentially, there's 4 steps in the process. first we write user stories, which is essentially a lightweight description of what it is that we want to build. Next, we're going to do the estimation, and that is where we're going to use story points, and I'll talk about story points in a minute. Then we're going to figure out how fast the team can actually move, and that is something where we use velocity, and then using the story points and the velocity combined, we create a forecast. What we're going to be focusing on today is the second step, which is coming up with these story points, which then feeds into the rest of the process. So when we talk about sitting down and estimating things, a lot of times what the team will do is say, all right, well, let's talk about this feature and let's break it into a bunch of tasks. So each feature is going to be turned into 10 or 15 tasks, and then we're going to say, well, we think this is 2 hours, and this is 5 hours, and this is 8 hours, and this is 20 hours, and it's a really time-consuming process. So the team oftentimes thinks, you know what, this just takes way too much time. And then that type of estimating is actually fraught with error. It doesn't really work that well. So anyone who's experienced on the team is going to say, you know what, this schedule really isn't going to be accurate. As soon as we start going, it somewhat becomes useless. Or management has come down and said, you know what, you guys have to ship it by January 20th, or all hell's going to break loose. And the team sort of walks away thinking, well, we're not going to be able to hit those dates anyway. So let's just start coding and hope for the best. Well, that doesn't really work, because what the stakeholders say is too freaking bad. I don't really care. You guys need to deliver on those things that I talked about in the other slide. I need this predictability. You can't tell me it's going to be done when it's done. That just doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for our business. We can't accomplish our business goals. So this Agile project estimation process addresses this problem. It addresses all the problems on the left because it's fast, it helps to generate an accurate schedule using those other pieces of the puzzle that I talked about a minute ago. And it actually allows you, based on tracking your velocity over time, to see how things are going and predict it. So let's just talk a little bit more about the traditional way of estimating. And so this is an example of a user story. As a shopper, I want a gift registry so I can share what I want with friends and family. So in this presentation, I'll be talking about a fictitious e-commerce website, and this is talking about the gift registry feature. So the development team gets together, and the project lead asks, well, how long do you think it'll take for this feature? And this guy thinks, well, 16 hours. Next person thinks 32 hours. And this third person on the end, well, she's coded gift registries 14 times before, and so she can do it in a day. The problem is that humans are actually really bad at estimating absolute size. And there's another problem here, which is that the first gentleman's 16 hours might be different than the next gentleman's 16 hours because he has a different level of experience. He's been with the company 10 or 15 years and knows exactly what it is that we need and doesn't need to ask many questions. And so those two factors combined means that this type of estimating really doesn't work very well. So we're going to talk about the difference between absolute estimation and relative estimation, so absolute versus relative size. And well, what do I mean by that? So if I showed you this glass of soda, or this cup of soda rather, and I asked you to estimate how many ounces are in that cup, that's really difficult for us to do. You know, the human brain is simply not equipped to do that. I have no idea how many ounces are in that cup. However, if I asked you to compare the sizes of different things, then we start being able to do that a lot better. I can look at these different size cups, and now that I have a way to judge in a relative fashion, now I can start getting some results. So absolute size is we're going to figure out how many hours this is going to take. Relative size is how big or small are these compared to each other. So if we're going to do that, we need some sort of measurement of size. We need a way to assign size to each of these cups. So that's where story points comes into play. Story points is simply an abstraction of size. It's literally has nothing to do with time, And that's actually a big benefit because we don't want to talk about time quite yet. And it's also based on a certain scale. It's very similar to a Fibonacci sequence with some small adjustments. And you'll see on the smaller end, the numbers are closer together. It starts at 0.5, 1, 2, 3, etc. But as the numbers get larger, the distance between them increases. And the reason is because when we do this estimation, there's still going to be an error. There's still going to be some problems with our estimate because we're sitting down and we're reading through the very lightweight specifications, and we don't really know all the ins and outs in terms of what's going to happen when we go and decide to code this particular story. And so what happens with these numbers is because there is a gap between them, and I'm only allowed to use these numbers for estimating, each number gives me a plus or minus 50% margin of error. So if I have a list of stories and I have assigned these numbers to all of them, when they're grouped together in a list, then I have the ability to actually get very accurate because some of the 8s are going to turn into 13s when it's all said and done. Some of the 5s are going to turn into 3s. Some of the 20s will turn into 13s, etc. So that plus or minus 50%, when grouped together as a list, tend to cancel each other out. And it becomes a very accurate way to estimate the overall size of doing everything in my list. So that's why we use story points. One, it abstracts away the concept of time because one person's hour is not the same as another person's hour. It gets us away from the absolute estimation because what we're going to do is we're going to put some stakes in the ground and say, well, this story feels like about a 2 and this one's a 5. So let's use that as our basis, and then we'll estimate the rest of the stories based on comparing these stories to that 2 and that 5. And then finally, it has the plus or minus 50% margin of error with each story, and then as we collect them together as a list, all those errors cancel each other out. This way and this approach of assigning relative size was coined by Mike Cohn, who is one of the founders of the Agile concept, and he's written a lot of books on Agile and Scrum. I highly recommend reading some of Mike Cohn's work. This is now commonly known as the Cohn scale because Mike Cohn came up with this scale. So let's see how this works. So going back to our cups example, let's just say we're going to call the small cup a 1. So now that we've put that stake in the ground and we have that small cup being a 1, I can look at the other cups and start comparing them. So yeah, this one looks like about twice the size. This one's a little bit bigger. Let's call that one a 3. And then finally, well, 5, is it an 8? Is it a 3? No, it's really a 5. It's not big enough to be an 8. So now I can very quickly and actually very accurately assign these estimates. And this is the exact same thing that we're going to do with our user stories. So what are some of our goals when we're estimating? So the first goal that we have is we really want to leverage the team experience. So if it's a guy that's been with the company for 15 years, we want to leverage his experience with our product and our culture and our technology. But if it's someone that we've just hired 2 months ago, we also want to leverage their experience. Maybe they've been working in other technologies and on other types of projects, but they've seen some things in their experience that we haven't seen, and vice versa. The other thing we want to do is we want to encourage discussion. We want to talk about these features. We want to make sure that we're really understanding what it is that we're estimating. We also want to involve everybody. We don't want a couple folks sitting off in the corner and just sort of in listening mode and never saying anything, because then we're sort of not really getting to that first point of leveraging the team experience. We can't leverage the team experience if 2 guys are sitting off in the corner not saying anything. And then the final thing we want to do is we want to make it democratic. And what I mean by that is that we don't want the guy that's been there 15 years throwing out all the estimates. I think that's a 5, that's an 8, and that's a 13. And everyone else in the room just sort of smiles and nods and says, well, this guy has been here forever. He must know what he's talking about. We really don't want that to happen because it's actually highly likely that he does know what he's talking about, but he may not be able to see everything about this particular story that we're estimating. And again, we have this desire to use the different viewpoints. And there's actually been some studies done that demonstrates when we have multiple opinions in terms of estimating, the estimates get a lot more accurate as compared to just having one person. So planning poker actually helps us accomplish all of these goals. And I'm going to walk through exactly how it works right now. So the first thing is we need some setup. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to assume that everybody can get physically together in one room. There's also a way to do this virtually, and there's a tool that I'll tell you about at the end that'll let you do that. So each team member is given a set of cards, which look like the cards down in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. And they have those story point values. You can see the 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, etc. And everyone on the team, excluding the product owner. So those of you who are familiar with Scrum know that the product owner is the overall team lead. They're the person responsible for understanding the customer vision and driving the vision into the team. So they're what we would call the client liaison built into the team. What we want to avoid, and they also represent the stakeholders and the business interests in terms of the project. What we want to avoid is we want to avoid the situation where, quote unquote, the boss comes in and says, you know what, guys, I think you can do this in 2 months, right? And everyone sort of smiles and says, well, I don't want to get fired by disagreeing with the boss, even though I know it's going to take 6 months. There's no possible way we can do it in 2 months. So this rule exists for just that reason. We don't want an overbearing product owner to sort of bully the team into saying, well, I think this is a 5. Don't you guys think this is a 5? This is really easy. And so the product owner is omitted from this process. So the next step is the product owner will read the user story and the acceptance criteria. And the acceptance criteria are essentially it's the checklist of what the product owner will review to decide whether or not this story is acceptable to them. The team talks about it, asks questions. Did you mean this? What about this? Did you think about that? And then once the discussion dies down, each team member selects a card. They put it down in front of them on the table. And then once everybody has put a card out, they'll all turn them over at the same time and see what everybody voted. And what's really nice about this process is that it doesn't let anyone sort of sit in the corner, because you're going to vote and then you're going to be asked maybe, well, why did you vote with that? Why did you put down a 3 or why did you put down an 8? And if you have no idea what was just discussed, you're going to look a little silly when it's time for you to explain why it is that you put down that vote. So they put down the cards, they turn them over, and then they talk about the differences. And I'll show you an illustration of an example. And then re-vote until the team reaches a consensus. So let's talk about this story again that I had earlier. As a shopper, I want a gift registry so I can share what I want with friends and family. And we have some acceptance criteria that the product owner has written. So I can create 1 or more registries, I can add a product, I can specify a quantity that I want, and I can review what I've put together, I can share it, I can remove products, and then finally I can rename my registry if I want to. So now the team sits down and says, okay, all right, that makes sense. And now they start asking some questions like, well, when they're creating a registry, what happens if the user leaves the name blank? Should we do something there? And the product owner says, oh yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that, but yeah, we need to warn them and make sure that they type in a name. And well, what about if they have already created a registry and they try to create the same one, or they try to create a new registry with the same name? Won't they have 2 in their list and they won't really know which one is which? And the product owner might say, well, you know what, we're doing the real basic version of this feature. If they want to do that, that's their problem. Or they could say, well, you know what, that is a big problem. This is an e-commerce site that needs to work for everybody regardless of their technical skill. And so yes, let's prevent that from happening. And then, well, what about if they try to type in a 0 quantity or a negative quantity? Well, yeah, let's make a note about that. And then what about this whole sharing a registry thing? What was it that you were thinking there? And the product owner would say, oh, well, I was thinking that you could put in 1 or more email addresses, we'd send them an email, and it would have a link to the registry. Okay, great. So as this discussion is happening, the acceptance criteria are being updated. And shown here in bold is what the team might be typing in and making notes about as this discussion is continuing. So it's really nice. Let me just stop here for a minute. What's really nice about this process is that planning poker is not all about getting to that number, getting to that story point number. It's also about beta testing the product owner's vision and description of this user story. Because since each team member is going to be asked to actually come up with a number, they all of a sudden get really interested in really understanding what it is that we're talking about. And we don't see this when we do the traditional type of estimating a lot of times. A lot of times with the traditional estimating, maybe one person will be asking these sorts of questions because they're really on the ball, but then the other folks are just sort of, going through the motion because they don't really believe in the process anyway. So as we're doing this estimating, we're also getting the team smart about what it is that we're going to build, and everybody's involved in this question and answer. And then, of course, we're capturing this additional detail that the team is going to need as we're going through this process. So it results in much more clear requirements, and it also results in the team understanding to a much higher degree of detail what it is that they're going to build, which then makes things go a lot faster when they start to put their head down and build the product. So how does the voting actually work? So we've had this discussion, and now Jim, Bill, and Jane are sitting there, and what they're going to do is they're each going to decide what it is that they're going to vote, and then they put their cards down. And that's an indication that I'm ready to go. My card's down in front of me, and we say, all right, ready, turn them over. And now we can see what everybody voted. And so you can see right here in this example, this illustrates one of the huge benefits of planning poker. If Jim was the guy that had been here for 15 years, and he said, it's a 5, Bill and Jane might not have actually said anything, because Bill's new to the company, and Jane, maybe she's a little shy, but she's got some great ideas and great background. And so Jim would have had this be at a 5, and maybe that's not the right number. So now what we do is we talk about differences. Now when the team does this and they sort of get used to the process, oftentimes the team will actually come up with the same number. Everyone will throw out a 5 or everyone will throw out an 8 because they're sort of on the same wavelength and everyone really understands what it's looking like. But this oftentimes happens as well. There are outliers. So we have the 8 in the middle, and then we've got the low end at 5, and we have the high end at 13. We want to hear what those people have to say. And that's really important because Jim might be thinking that this is really easy and here's why, and then he convinces the rest of the team, yeah, that makes sense. It really should be a 5. Because we do want these numbers to be accurate. We don't want to sandbag the numbers and make everything a 13 even though it should have been a 5 or a 3 or a 2, because we want to make sure that we have a good, accurate estimation. So, but in this case, maybe I say to Jim, all right, Jim, what do you think here? And Jim says, you know what, I've built this a bunch of times, and it's no big deal. It's real easy, no problem. I could do this in my sleep. And then we say, all right, Bill, you're at a 13. Why 13? And he says, you know what, I'm real concerned about that email piece about the sharing the registry. We haven't built any email framework, I don't think, into this app. Maybe, I'm pretty new here, but I don't think we've built anything. And then finally, Jane says, well, Jim, you know what, it might be easy for you, but you might not be the one coding this. So we need to take that into account. And Bill, we did actually already create the email infrastructure. It was before you showed up at the company, but we do have that. And that's why I voted an 8. So I don't agree with Jim that it's going to be quite that easy, but Bill, I'm thinking the 13 might be a little much. So this discussion, as much discussion as is necessary, and then we say, all right, revote. So everyone takes their cards back, and now each person is going to come up with a new number, and then they flip them over, and then we have a consensus. Sometimes you'll still have an outlier, like maybe Jim sticks to his 5. And then we say, Jim, you know, we heard you in terms of the 5. We're a little nervous about that. Are you willing to come up to an 8? And Jim might say, you know what, you guys are probably right. If you end up doing it or I'm on vacation that week, it's going to be harder for you guys. I'll come up to an 8, no problem. So we repeat this process for each of our stories. And at the end of the day, we come up with story points for our stories, and a total overall number of story points. And this actually goes really quickly, particularly compared to the traditional approach of breaking everything down into tasks and putting hours on each of the tasks. And so this is just a sample. This is going to be pretty small for a real product backlog. Typical projects are going to have larger product backlog. But even then, most product backlogs can be estimated within, say 2 to 3 or maybe 4 meetings of a couple of hours each. And that's really not a lot of time, particularly since the old way, breaking things down into tasks, can take weeks. I've done that process with my teams years ago. We sat down. I didn't have any better tools. I didn't have these tools. So I sat down and stuck the team in a room for a couple of weeks, all day long, every day, and we just broke the thing down and broke it down and broke it down. What's also really beneficial about this approach is that you now start to empower the stakeholders, because since Agile is all about change and all about sort of delivering the stakeholders' wants and needs and desires, the stakeholders can start to understand what the trade-offs are. So if they, for example, said that, you know what, I'm hearing some feedback about our product, and that one there in the middle, as a shopper, I want to review my orders so I can see what I've purchased in the past. That one's becoming more important. And they can see, well, it's pretty small, guys, right? You guys said it was a 3. Can we move that up to the top without really making a huge impact in terms of what we're doing? And the team will say, yeah, that's great. Or they can also say, you know what, I want to add a new feature or add a new story. Can you guys estimate this story that we've just heard about from some of our prospective customers and tell me how big it is? And they say, well, you know what, this story is a 5. And then they say, let's talk about removing one of those 20s. And so not only am I going to be able to add this 5, I'm going to have a little bit of room left to either ship a little bit earlier than we thought, or absorb some additional risk just in case something blows up in our face, or maybe I can add another story. So this technique is very helpful because the stakeholders get to have more power in terms of understanding what the trade-offs are. And then finally, because we're executing this process and then delivering the software every couple of weeks and telling our stakeholders how fast we're going, there starts to become a high level of trust between the development team and the stakeholders. And that's good for everybody because it flies in the face of sort of the old adage of engineering and the business are always at each other's throats, or engineering and sales are always at each other's throats. This really allows everyone to work together and drive toward those business results. So that's what the process looks like. Just one final piece here. Well, how do we get started? And I talked briefly about this earlier. So what you do is you take your list of user stories, and which is collected in what's called the product backlog, and the team picks a story that looks like a 2. And so we go and look through the list and we say, yeah, I think this one's a 2. And then maybe someone else says, well, I don't think that's quite small enough to be a 2, that's a little big, because what about this? And we're going to need to do that, and we'll need to build this, and then we're going to need to interface with that. And they say, oh, yeah, that's probably bigger than a 2. Well, what about this login story? Login, that's a known problem. This is pretty straightforward. We're not allowing any logins using social media accounts. It's just a username and a password and I forgot my password. What do you guys think about this? Great. Login, let's call that one a 2. And then we're going to look through the backlog and pick a story that we think looks like a 5. So it's not a little bit bigger than a 2. It's a little bit more large. So it's not a 3, it's a 5. And let's pick one that sort of feels like that now that we have something to compare it to with the 2. And now those are our anchor stories. So each story that we look at that point now allows us to compare it. All right, is it the same size as the login? Is it a little smaller than the login? Is it larger than the login? Is it larger than this other story, which is a 5? So now we can do that estimating process and by comparing and contrasting. So that's the process. That's how you get started. And finally, some resources for you guys. So for planning poker cards, Mountain Goat Software, that happens to be Mike Cohn's company, the gentleman I mentioned earlier that came up with that series of story point values. Very high quality cards are actually also very low cost. I have a whole bunch of them that I hand out to our clients and our team members. And also there's virtual online planning poker. So these days, particularly, there's lots of distributed teams, and you can go online to planningpoker.com, and you can do this same exact process where you have the cards and the ability to put the card out in front of you, so to speak, quote unquote, virtually. And then once everybody puts their cards out, you can either automatically have them all turned over, or you can click a button and they all turn over, and then you can discuss and revote, etc. And so those are two great tools to help you with this process. Also, a couple blog posts that you might be interested in. And I can't remember if Angela mentioned at the beginning, but we will send out a link for you to download these slides, and also a link to a recording of this session in case you want to go back and review anything. But in the slide deck, these are hyperlinks. First one, 7 answers to the most frequently asked questions about planning poker. That dives into some questions that perhaps we won't cover today. And then that next blog post, Why We Love Agile Estimation, and you should too, is all about the overall process of creating the user stories, which forms your product backlog, doing this estimation process, determining velocity, and then finally coming up with a schedule or forecast in terms of turning those story points into time. So have a look at those, and certainly reach out to us if you have any additional questions. You can reach out to me directly. I'm on Twitter at Dave_Todaro, and we're at Ascendle.com, and Ascendle.com/blog for our blog. So again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time out today to join us, and now we'll move into questions. All right, so I have the first question here, which is, what if the team comes up with questions that the product owner cannot answer? And so we're discussing the user story, and the team says, well, what about this, or what about that? And sometimes the product owner will actually say, well, you know what, guys, I don't really know the answer to that. And so what you do is essentially table the discussion at that stage of the game and say, you know what, I'm going to need to get some more information. So if you're in a professional services environment, you might need to go back to the client and clarify something and try to figure out, all right, what is it? What do we want to do here? Oftentimes the product owner, because of their discussions with the client and the customers, can make that decision. And that's what we want them to do if they can. But other times we need to say, let me find out more information, so you table it. So that's the answer to that question. Let's see, another question here, which is, what if a technical discussion ensues during the poker process? I.e., if we do it this way, it is super easy, but we might need to get this plugin or integrate with this third-party service. And by the way, I know of a plugin that we can use, or I know of a third-party service we can use. So that does come up. So as the team sort of brainstorming or talking and discussing these user stories, that sort of thing does come up. And what we do is we make notes about it. So right in the story, right in the acceptance criteria, we'll go down to the bottom and create another section underneath the acceptance criteria that we'll call technical notes. And then we'll actually make some of those notes. We might want to use the ABC plugin to handle this, or there's a web service that lets you do this, and we're not going to have to write the code. We just need to integrate with the web service. So that's another question that can come up. And then let's see, one more question here is, well, what if the team can't all physically be together? And well, that ties into that planningpoker.com. For a completely distributed team, you can do that, but you can actually do sort of a hybrid approach. You could have folks in the room, you could crank up a GoToMeeting and have some other folks use the planning poker, or you could actually have everyone bring their laptops and do everything virtually using that planningpoker.com. And then the last question I have here is, does everyone on the team need to be involved in the planning poker? That's ideal. It's great if you can have the entire team there for the whole thing, because again, a lot of the planning poker process is not just about coming up with those story point numbers. It's also about making the team smart and leveraging everybody's experience on the team so that we can get the best perspective. But if you're trying to find a time and there's 5 people on the team or 6 people on the team and one person can't make it to one of the meetings or maybe a couple of the meetings, I would still charge ahead and do that. Do your best to have everybody there, but not to the point where it's holding things up. So if you guys are ready to dig in and do your estimating and someone's on vacation, I wouldn't hold off for a week to start the process just because that person's on vacation. I would dive in with the rest of the team. So that's all the questions I saw. Angela, do you see any other questions or any? I don't see any hands raised at this stage of the game.
That cleared it
I think I
out.
got
So
everybody.
if, yeah, you did. Is there anybody else who, let's just give it kind of one more chance, one more shout out. And at this point, if somebody needs to turn on their audio in order to speak, they're uncomfortable with that raising hand feature or something, I can actually make that possible. Let's see. Okay. So that should make it possible if anybody wants to speak. Okay, I think that's it, Dave.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you everybody again for taking the time today, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.